Gather round, lads and lassies, boys and girls, and anyone in between or as yet undecided. Welcome to Mr. Stitch's Funhouse of Horror. I, of course, am your host, Mr. Damien Stitch himself. You may call me Mr. Stitch. I will also accept Lord, Sir, maybe Your Honor, if you feel like you're being accused of something. Now you may be looking at the dusty and ragged tatters of my topcoat and vest, my crumpled top hat, perhaps even the stitches sewn into my flesh, carving my smile all the wider, wondering if you have ever seen the likes of me before. And I reckon you have. Though not in memories of which you're so readily aware, I would think. Not in those you could so easily revisit. Oh yes, y'all know me, still the same OG, but have been low-key, hated on by most of these clowns who know cheese, no deals and no G's, no wheels and no keys, no boats and no wait, that's no right. Dr. Damien Stitch does have a nice ring though. Yeah, no. But somewhere deep down, somewhere you can't so easily pick out, oh yes, you do know me, don't you? No, it's no accident that you found yourself in front of my little house of fun, nor that you're standing here before me now. You may be reluctant to enter, the fear of what may lurk inside, eating away at your tiny entrails like a parasite. The curiosity and intimidation blending together to form the most irresistible sensation of anticipation you have ever felt. Perhaps not. Yeah, I'm looking at you, wee pigtailed lass in the back. Oh, you didn't have to enter. Not if you don't want to. But whilst I have your undivided attention, allow me to tell you a tale. One of the numerous stories of those who have walked through those very doors, only a stone's throw from this very spot. You see, long before I took the reins to this magical, haunting, and eerie monstrosity, before I left my righteous path behind, the stitches now etched into my flesh waiting, I too had my own story of torment and horror. A terrifying tale that would chill you to the very bone, your blood freezing cold in your veins. A story that I will not bloody be sharing. Mind your business, you nosy wee urchins. No, this tale involves a wee boy of the tender age of 11. He was not as upstanding as you lads and lasses. He was not one who would offer a smile to a, unique individual such as I. Oh yes, he only had insults to offer when we met for both the first and the last time. Before that Halloween night would come to a close, of course. He would not only understand a little more about the truth of who I am, but the reality of his own misguided ways. So gather round, ye wee ghouls and ghosts. Rest your little legs and take a seat. I am speaking to you, 13th Beetlejuice Jr. I've seen today. You're a bit restless. You need to pee? No? You sure? I'm no turning this ready car around once I get going. You sure? Yeah? Certain now. Alright then. And so, we begin. In a small suburban home some 40 miles from this very park.
But you promised!
The small-framed boy yelped, his jet-black hair hanging wildly before his darkened, spiteful gaze. We promised that if you were good, we would take you to the park, the tall, slender, and exhausted Mr. Jacob Rigby said, his thinning, dark hair receding all the more as he glared into his son's deep brown eyes. It was a classic stare-down between father and son, one almost willing to do anything to inspire the young man to retreat from the oncoming fit, and the other prepared to push every button he had to get his way. As the boy began to scream, a high-pitched wail, which was certain to send the few remaining hairs rooted to the scalp of his dad fluttering in the wind, he knew he could break his old man. Jacob exhaled a heavy breath, Lurk, his lovely, dark wavy-haired wife, rubbing the small of his back in an effort to ease the pounding of his head.
"Okay!"
Mr. Rigby shouted, startling both his wife and son with his out-of-character screaming.
"Get dressed, and we'll go. If you'll fucking shut up."
Lurk gazed upon her loving husband of the last 14 years, holding a hand to her chest and the other still on his back. She just gave him a defeated but understanding nod.
"At least we can get a funnel cake,"
she said with a laugh. "I know my female voice is cringeworthy. Didn't give me that glare, wee pigtailed lass. I'm trying here. Let's hear you do a man's voice, eh?"
Heh, yeah, that's what I thought.
When Lurk and Jacob had promised to take their son to Arcadian Heights for this wonderful Halloween celebration, it was a meager attempt to settle down a previous fit. Connor, named after his grandfather, his mother's father, had been prone to such frenzies since his earliest year on this earth. His parents attempted to control this with kindness, and whilst I am not one to condone violence inflicted on children, some little brats need a good ruddy spanking. Connor Rigby was one that should have had his arse tanned from an early age, but his now beyond exhausted parents felt as though there was little chance of ever settling down the boy, for more than moments at a time. While they drove the bustling roads to the amusement park that afternoon, their son gazing wide-eyed through the window at the world rushing by, a satisfied smirk on his smug wee face, they could only hope that he wouldn't show his arse in public. This, of course, was the very reason they were hesitant to take him out in the first place, as the boy would often go out of his way to perform for any respective audience. This time, however, when he got his way, he would be in for a rude awakening, one that would not only put an end to his fit pitching, but may very well leave those days numbered. In the end, of course, I suspect that either outcome would have left his parents quite relieved. Getting ahead of myself there. Apologies for that. Oh yes, lads and lasses. I would imagine that even all of your loving parents have had those moments in which they would have been overjoyed to get rid of you. Good luck getting them to admit that, though. Oh, didn't he give me that look, wee minion? I'm just setting the atmosphere. Sheesh. Take a bloody joke, will you? For the first few hours, the whole Rigby family laughed and joked like they hadn't in years. Even the youngest member of the group was distracted enough to just be a child, rather than the little shit, than the beast he more often exposed his parents to. They rode rides together, the loving couple taking turns beside the boy on the two-person carriages. They feasted on the delicious food, the scents intoxicating their every sense as they passed by the glorious eyries and stalls. They played sideshow games, Jacob's buttocks clenching a bit when his son failed to shoot the little vampire duckies to win himself a prize. Sure, the kid dropped the wee BB gun back on its perch, muttering under his breath, but he didn't lose it, to his folks' surprise. Whether he was simply allowing himself to have too much fun to risk sticking a fork in it, his mother and father certain to drag him kicking and screaming from the park if he flipped his lid, or if it just wasn't enough of an inconvenience for him to waste his energy, I couldn't say. But both the elder Rigbys let out a shared sigh of relief when they moved on to whatever lay beyond the games. That was, of course, until they came upon this glorious establishment. The sun had set some time before they crossed into that very path to your backs. My funhouse looked quite inviting, surrounded by the glorious darkness and carnival lighting. Oh, wee Connor's eyes feasted on the haunting imagery I present to you now. The eerie clowns in the windows, the fabricated, rickety wooden steps, and even the warning signs before you, recommending that no sane person would ever willingly enter such a place. It's all in good fun, of course. There's no real danger in there. Well, not for the pure of heart, anyway. None of you, good children, would have anything to fear. Isn't that right, pigtails? Now, when Connor Rigby caught sight of my humble funhouse, his eyes lit up so much I was certain they would pop right out of his skull. Why, I could practically see his wee mouth watering as he tugged at his father's jacket, pulling his attention to his next desire. Jacob and Lorraine gave each other a reluctant glance, silently debating between their complete lack of interest in entering any sort of haunted house and the potential tirade from their son. Hopefully, that day's activities and fun could have possibly both tired their child out as much as themselves, and satisfied him to the point of accepting an easy defeat. Jacob leaned down to face the small-statured boy. "How about we just hit up a few more rides before we have to head home?" he suggested, a compassionate look on his face.
"But I want to go in,"
the boy declared, inspiring his parents' spines to stiffen in unison.
"These places are all smoke and mirrors, Connor,"
Lorraine said, hopeful to rationalize with the boy.
"It's just a waste of money for some cheap thrills. Like your dad said, I want to go into the Funhouse."
Connor's face was already turning that particular shade of red, which led to Jacob's hair abandoning his scalp in the first place. His parents once more glanced at one another, that mental discussion weighing the pros and cons.
"You know these sorts of things scare your dad,"
Lorraine said with a giggle, nudging her husband playfully. "Yeah," Jacob added. "I'll have nightmares for a week."
"Then let me go in by myself,"
the boy said through gritted teeth, his skin still burning all the more. "Connor," Jacob said, his heart racing all the more as a passing elderly couple gave a scornful glance. "Come on, son. We've had a fun day. Can't you just—"
"I want to go in!"
the boy screamed, pulling every surrounding eye to the trio, mine included. His hands were balled into fists, while his parents visibly trembled before me. The couple stared at the boy, begging him to come with a hopeless glance. The boy just stared back, shooting knives with his gaze, looking as though he was about to boil over. Yes, I could have just sat back and enjoyed the show. Admittedly, I was a wee bit curious to see how far the lad would take it, but with such agony present on the faces of his absurdly defeated guardians, I saw this as my cue to step in. "Well, good evening, dear lads and lass," I said, clapping the boy across his back, maybe a wee bit harder than was warranted. "Do I stand before a potential customer?" Young Connor spun to face me, swatting my hand away.
"Don't touch me,"
he sneered, whilst I simply smiled back at him. For the briefest of moments, he looked a wee bit scared. Sort of hurt my feelings, if I'm being honest. Does this look like a scary smile? Oh, didn't he scream? Sheesh. It's not that bad, is it? He wants to see what's in there, Jacob said with a sigh, looking at me in a way that begged me to confirm it would be way too much for a wee lad. Of course, I would not back him up on this, as this particular boy was in desperate need of a lesson that I was certain I could provide. "I assure you, Mr. Rigby, Jacob Rigby. I assure you, Mr. Rigby, there's no safer spot in the park for your son. I can personally guarantee his safety." Again, the couple just glanced at each other, while the boy still studied me.
"What are you supposed to be?"
he said, furrowing his brow.
"Some sort of mime?"
"Oh, I'm no mime, boy. I'm Damien Stitch, the owner of this humble funhouse."
"Stitch? Because of the stitches in your stupid face? Real original, mister. Why not Mr. Top Hat? It'd save you from putting on all that dumb makeup."
"Makeup? I've never worn makeup in my life, thank you very much." He just stared at me, with a look on his face like I just broke wind. Honestly, I might have done just that. Never can tell, you know. They just sort of sneak out sometimes. Oh, everybody does it, pigtails. I bet you stink your folks right out of your house sometimes. So the poor Rigby couple glanced back at me with a smile, seemingly admiring the way I handled myself with their little with their ill-tempered child.
"How much to get in?"
Lorraine asked with a bit of a sigh. I looked at her, to her husband, and back to the boy before me. The kid still looked at me like I had worms dropping out of my mouth, but that only made me all the more determined to get him through those doors. "Tell you what," I said, granting the couple a friendly smirk. "I'll give you fine folks a freebie. If your boy comes out satisfied, well, I do accept tips, of course." I tipped my hat to the now smiling couple. Clearly the idea of having a break from their little demon was quite enticing, given the relief in their eyes. "I promise you that the boy will have an eye-opening experience." With that, the mother and father knelt down to gaze directly into the eyes of their boy, practically pleading for the lad to behave himself. He, naturally, rolled his eyes at the words, turning his back to them to head toward the door. I gave the couple a wink as I followed behind the child. He glanced back at me as he reached the steps, to which I offered a nod, granting him permission to head on in. Not that he really needed that much, of course. As he pushed through the door, strolling in like he owned the ruddy place, I took my seat alongside the entrance. From here on out, I knew that I could count on the house to take the wheel from here. My work, for the time being, was done. Whatever would occur inside, well, that was in the hands of Connor Rigby himself. This, dear lads and lasses, was when the real fun would... Okay, seriously, Beetlejuice, you're squirming like a ruddy snake. If you got a peel, wait a minute. No? You're sure? Alright, but if you wet yourself right here, you'll get a free trip inside too. Oh, didn't you give me that look, Pigtails? You're sitting right next to him. I'm just saying. As I was saying, this is where the real fun begins. When Connor hesitantly stepped through the door, after successfully climbing up the steps, attempting to pretend that his wee legs weren't trembling just a bit, the darkened room he walked into left him shivering all the more. The second he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving him in pure, pitch darkness. He jumped with that unexpected slam, suddenly gripped by the fear. Though he had no respective audience now, his parents left to their own devices, with their son locked away for a time. He's still trying to play it off. Standing in place, fumbling behind him for the doorknob to his back, one he would not locate, as there is no interior knob on that particular door. Well, not at that moment, anyway. He briefly considered pounding on the bloody thing, demanding to be set free. Naturally, even at such a young age, his already fragile ego would not tolerate admitting defeat only moments after entering. Honestly, I wouldn't have expected any less, though it would have been quite disappointing had he chosen that course of action. When another door, some 15 feet ahead of where he stood, quaking in the same spot, creaked open, shedding a warm, violet light across the room, he still wrestled with the decision to proceed or fight to depart. Ultimately, after some minutes of this inner debate, he reluctantly began to pace forward, ever so cautiously. While this room was free of any obstacles, the subtle illumination only revealed so much of the wooden floor, so he could not fully trust eyes still not accustomed to the darkness to feel secure in that fact. As he hesitantly peered through his hopeful exit to greener pastures, nudging it gently to investigate what lay within the next room, he let out an unimpressed sigh, rolling his eyes at the sights before him. Yes, my hall of mirrors is not much different from the average funhouse flare. Well, not in its appearance anyway. But what did the wee brat expect? I mean, certain things are just traditional in places like these after all. Of course, even with his condescending chuckles, mixed with a sprinkling of relief that safety lay ahead of him, wee Connor found himself smiling as he began to walk through the labyrinth of distorted reflections. He flexed his little arms as one of the mirrors showed him an exaggeratedly proportioned upper body, and giggled almost uncontrollably when another showed him far shorter and wider, waddling from side to side in that one. Oh yes, his apprehension and fears, even his eye-rolling, had drifted away as he neared the end of the rows of many shapes and sizes of deformed doppelgangers. That was, of course, until he creaked open the door, which would lead to the next level of fun, when a blood-curdling scream reached his ears. He spun in place, following the strained howl, which rang out from somewhere to his back, his legs trembling far more aggressively than before when the grotesque sight greeted his eyes. He could only assume that his echoing laughter as he traipsed through the mirror maze had drowned out the ambient noises of the others who entered behind him, some of whom scampered their wee legs in this direction now, those who also hoped to escape the tall, slender, and masked individual who thrust what appeared to be some sort of blunt object against the face of a shrieking man who seemed to have been the unfortunate escort for this group. With the haunting sound of a constant pummeling of that blood-soaked chunk of rebar against his victim's face, taller and shorter, wider and narrower frames of an assortment of children pushed past the slack-jawed boy, swatting away the hand which still rested on the door to the next room. It wasn't until then that he managed to pry his eyes away from the twitching man who now fell limp to the floor, his murderer now cutting his darkened gaze to those attempting to escape. "You alright, minion? You're looking a wee bit skittish. I can't stop now, so you're just gonna have to hold it. Pigtails, you still with me? There's no sense covering your eyes, lass. This is a story, not a film." Connor let out a... "No, Beetlejuice. I told you to go before we left. I'm no turning this car around." "Aye, go on then, but we're no waiting for you." Connor let out a strained whine, a whimper he intended to be a scream, but it wouldn't breach his throat. The masked figure got back to his feet, revealing himself to be what the shivering boy assumed to be almost 7 feet tall. As he lowered his weapon to his side, dripping crimson to the widening puddle at his feet, Connor just gazed into the haunting face, looking back at him. It was as though there were no eyes hidden behind that dark gaze, with what appeared to be orange makeup, with that eerie jet black where the mouth and eyes should be, like a grotesque pumpkin hovering above a long, tattered black coat. When the lanky individual took a single step forward, this allowed the quivering boy to reconnect with his motor functions, pushing through the door the other children had slammed shut behind them. Still attempting to make his voice work, he tried to yell out to grab the attention of the others, who were only silhouetted forms drifting into the distance of the fabricated forest before him. His legs feeling as though they were fighting quicksand, he knew he had to either bugger off as quickly as possible or find a fitting place to hide. Pounding his fists against his thighs, he demanded that they obey his will, pushing harder with every desperate step. Finally, his hastened heart rate shot the blood to his extremities, allowing him to run faster than he probably ever had before. The sound of the creaking hinges of the door he left behind, such an agonizing echo, drifting directly into his horror-stricken ears. As he rounded a wide, phony bush set to climb the tree to his left, he almost jumped out of his skin when he all but ran into the shivering preteen boy huddled behind the shrubbery. He didn't stop or try to warn the child that their pursuer was coming, only shook his head as he pushed onward, settling on the next sturdy-looking tree ahead. He didn't look back or pay any attention to the fact that he was waving every bloody branch he touched like a signal flare as he made his way up the tree, looking for hopeful safety. It wasn't until he nestled himself some 15 feet from the ground, battling to keep his breathing shallow, that he allowed himself a hesitant glance back to the path he had chosen. With his bodily tremors making it all the more difficult to keep himself concealed, the boy glared, unblinking, as the hauntingly tall figure approached, the ragged hem of his coat trailing blood in its wake. When the man stopped, right next to the now whimpering child huddled behind the bush, Connor begged himself to look away before what came next. The bald man, with orange concealing his entire head, aside from the blackened highlights, looked to his right, studying the wee lad who glared up at him. For a moment, they just stared at one another, almost as if the eerie figure was attempting to decide what to do next. Connor briefly considered that perhaps this grotesque beast would not harm a child, that he may yet survive this night. But as that smeared pumpkin raised its haunting gaze to meet the one still trembling in that tree, that dark smile growing ever wider, he knew this was wishful thinking at best. With one swift swipe, not breaking his gaze from the one upon the tree branch, the man thrust his already dripping weapon against the head of the boy behind the bush. That one hit was all it took to to almost split the head in two, bursting it apart like a water balloon to a brick wall. When the small-framed boy slumped to the floor, his wee legs still kicking ever so slightly, the man in the blood-stained coat looked back to the path ahead. He just strolled nonchalantly onward, not as much as glancing back up to the boy, shivering so much that he almost dropped from his perch. For what felt like hours, he just stayed in that spot, battling to not glance down at the gory sight below. He had to believe that his parents would have gotten worried about him by now, that they would run in any moment to carry him back out to safety. Of course, as he considered this wish to hastily depart this park and never look back, another thought occurred to him. If the man he had already witnessed putting two innocent victims to a grisly end had entered through the same door as him, could those on the outside have met a similar fate as those who lay bloody upon the floor of this funhouse of true horror? So he just sat there, attempting to make out the slightest of sounds beyond the sticky fluids still spritzing to the bush beneath his branch. Only silence greeted his ears. No screams, no meaty impacts, no scampering footfalls or slow-paced steps. Nothing. After a few moments of seconds feeling exaggerated to minutes and hours, Connor hesitantly made his return to the fabricated grassy floor below. Whipping his gaze upward when his eyes turned immediately to the pummeled face still oozing behind that shrubbery, he considered which direction to be his best route to safety. He glanced to the direction in which he had been fleeing before hastily climbing the false tree. He whipped his head back to the door through which he had entered this wretched, phony forest. Only one room between him and the lobby that way, but the door had swung shut behind him, leaving no exit from that darkened room. Yet the rock and hard place he was caught between felt all the more tormenting with each breath he took, but his feet picked his destination before his wee mind had a chance to chime in. He would plunder forward through my little funhouse, bracing himself for whatever may lie ahead. Certain there was no easy way out behind him, this seemed a more logical choice to his fragmenting wee brain. Those first few steps were the most difficult to achieve, his legs shaking so violently he was certain they would give out beneath him. But every one became a little more confident than the last, transforming to a more focused stride by the time the next door came into view. Well, welcome back, wee Beetlejuice. That must have been a number 2 after all. Oh, didn't he give me that look? Everyone poops for crying out loud. Even you, pigtails. No, I will not catch you up. It's no my fault you couldn't hold it any longer. Sheesh. Alright, you settled? Yeah? Okay, where were we? Oh, the next room. As Connor hesitantly nudged the unlatched door ajar, he was almost shocked to see that the next room wasn't a room at all, but the exit back to the outside world. Even more puzzling to the already scattered senses of the lad was the silence that greeted his ears, all the more unsettling than the sight of only vacant rides and unmanned stalls. He wandered out, his wee heart beating against the inside of his sternum, his steps all the more reluctant than those more confident ones up until this point, his legs shaking as he practically hobbled down the 3 steps that led to the concrete ground. He kept darting his eyes from one side to the other in search of anyone, but there wasn't a hint of any life beyond his own. Wandering around the side of the building, keeping close to the exterior walls, his ears were still on guard, just as much as his quivering eyes. When he arrived back in front, only a wee jump from where he sit right now, his legs turned to useless noodles, dropping his arse to the pavement at the sight of the varying pools of crimson glistening in the ambient lighting around him. There were no bodies, only puddles of where several may have lain, gushing their fluids to the concrete. But he didn't need to see any corpses to fear that he may be the last man standing in this otherwise deserted park. Stumbling back to his gelatinous legs, he screamed out, not even taking the time to consider that this may draw the attention of the only other person he worried may be lurking about. He fled past more vacant stalls and roller coasters, still gliding across the tracks with no passengers on board. Certain he was now completely alone, aside from the one who may very well put his life to a sticky and gruesome end, he continued to call out his hopeless wails. He just ran, his wee legs aching with every step, his pulse quickening with sheer panic all the more. When he heard a distant voice, however, one that sounded to be in as much of a frenzied state as himself, both the fear and hesitant jubilation gripped him in equal measures. Yes, the howling voice of a panicked adult female sounded just as anguished as his own hopeless shrieks, but he wasn't alone after all. On top of that, after that almost agonized wail, when the sound of multiple footsteps reached his ears, he felt hope spark in his throbbing chest. Yes, given the fear in that scream, he had no doubt that one set of clomping feet belonged to the one from whom he was desperate to escape. But if his senses weren't betraying him, he was certain there was at least 2 others in pursuit. His desire to track down someone, anyone besides his own chaotic thoughts, his decision was made before he even understood. Though his legs were quivering and his feet aching, he pushed himself onward in the direction of those hastened steps, growing louder by the second. Rounding a corner, past the vacant line to one of the more popular roller coasters, one which had been filled beyond its capacity only a little while ago, he skidded to a halt so aggressively that he tumbled to the ground, his eyes transfixed to the scene playing out before him. The still spinning but unmanned carousel some 40 feet ahead may have had no passengers, but was not so vacant as every other ride he had passed. That howling scream sounded all the more visceral as the flailing blonde woman pressed to the ground, begged for release. As the masked figure in the long, tattered, and now positively blood-caked coat held a broken bottle high, preparing to plant it into the throat of his victim, multiple gunshots rang out in succession. Feeling a spark of hope awakening within, the wee lad scuffled back to his feet as the short and stocky, brown-haired officer approached the haunting figure who now slumped to the concrete. His footsteps still reluctant, but not quite as shaky as before, the boy began to wander closer to the grisly scene before him, freezing in his tracks once more when the situation took a turn for the far more grotesque. As the officer hesitantly approached the still twitching body of the man he had gunned down, he wouldn't let his guard drop. Speaking of guards, the other bloke with him, a tall and wiry security guard. Ugh, 3 mentions of guard in a row? What sort of bloody storyteller am I? Yeah, sorry about that. You still good, minion? Your gut's still bubbling a wee bit? Okay. The security person was still a ways behind the cop, as he was only armed with little more than a healthy-sized flashlight, and appeared to be trembling harder than the young boy. But the second the officer kicked the bottle from the grip of the limp figure on the ground, the pumpkin-faced monstrosity practically leaped back to his feet. Before the poor bugger could squeeze off another round, the man whipped his hand around the poor bloke's neck, pushing his head into the still spinning carousel. With every sculpted horse that made contact with a meaty thunk, more fragments of the now spasming officer's skull peeled away, the flesh and bone raining across the already gore-lined coat of his murderer. When he finally dropped the body to the ground beside the still whimpering woman, he just studied the violently trembling security guard, still gazing on, slack-jawed. After that brief moment, he leaned down, lifting his discarded bottle from beside the twitching cop, and silencing the whining woman for good by burying the jagged glass into her neck. As the sticky fluids gushed from around the bottle and spurted through its top, drenching the tattered coat in more... You need a minute, Pigtails? You're looking a wee bit green around the gills. You sure? I mean, I can stop now if... Alright. If you're gonna spew. Okay, if you say so. You good, minion? Beetlejuice, you're looking a wee bit pale yourself. Alright then. Those dark, empty sockets cut from the quaking security person back to the boy, now frozen in his tracks. That blackened gaze, now transfixed with Connor's leaking eyes, the smeared orange head tilting from one side to the other, looking thoroughly perplexed, or his expression in any way legible. As the haunting figure began pacing toward the lad, the security guard backing away before scampering off in the opposite direction, Connor took off in a flat-out sprint. His side was splitting within seconds, with his heart threatening to burst within his chest, but he wouldn't slow down, certain he would meet his sticky end if he did. When the footsteps to his back picked up their pace, matching every step the boy took, desperate to find sanctuary, the Rigby lad just knew he hadn't a chance of outrunning his pursuer. Not only was he already beyond winded, but with his own burning legs being considerably shorter than those matching his strides, it would only be a matter of moments until that monstrous form closed the gap. Finally, without a hope of pushing his exhausted body any further, the boy fell to the concrete, gasping for every labored breath. He knew he was finished, that whatever that thing was would catch up any second. He had reached the end of his road and the last semblance of hope. Rolling onto his back, leaning up to the best of his ability, his eyes once more met those of inevitability before him. Scuffling his wee bum across the ground, kicking his heels against the pavement, he knew he couldn't escape, but wouldn't he yield in his pitiful efforts to extend those final moments of his life. Gazing upon every stain left in the wake of each victim of this grotesque creature, before looking back to those eerily dark eyes, every last shred of hope poured upon his sweat-lined shirt in a river of tears. When the man just stopped in place, only a foot or two from where the boy still wept onto the concrete, they just glared at each other again.
What are you waiting for?
Connor stuttered, suddenly begging for this to be over already. Once more, the tall and slender figure just tilted its head, as though confused by this outburst. After some minutes spent with the two just studying each other, the man reached into his coat, slipping a lengthy, serrated blade from inside. The boy just tensed from head to toe, his shivering only interrupted for a moment before transforming to a near spasming state. Outstretching the knife before it, turning the slender wrist from one side to the other, almost as if to allow the kid to fully take in every detail of the weapon that would be snuffing him out, the blade was released to the ground, before being nudged closer to the boy with a foot still hidden beneath the tattered coat. Perplexed enough to almost interrupt the flow of his tears, Connor just glanced from the discarded blade and back to the one who now gestured with a nod, as though instructing the boy to pick it up. Without taking the time to consider the true motivations behind this, he leapt forward, snatching the weapon up, brandishing it like a sword before him. The pumpkin-faced monstrosity slowly lifted its crimson-stained hand to his coat again, snapping the buttons loose one by one. as he pulled open the sticky, gore-lined garment, revealing a sickeningly pale, emaciated, and bony chest covered in intricate tattoos and tattered jeans, speckled with as many gruesome stains as the coat. Connor began to tremble all the more. Gently lowering to its knees, the figure then raised its bloody mitt to its face, digging its fingernails into the side of its cheek. Connor let out a horrified yelp as the thing pierced its own flesh, slowly peeling it away like a mask. Because that's exactly what it was. Something that took the boy some time to fully register, as that yelp transformed into a high-pitched shriek of pure terror. As the thing finished tearing away the orange, black, and scarlet speckled latex, tossing it to the side like a used mask he didn't even want to wear anymore. Connor found himself no longer gazing upon a monster, but a man. A man who appeared almost harmless now as he pulled open his coat once more. A man who was far more familiar to the glassy eyes of the trembling boy than he could fully accept. Right here, a soft and almost friendly voice said, pointing to where his almost sunken sternum ended while gripping the hem of his coat, "Just push it up with all your might." Connor just glared, wide-eyed and slack-jawed, his body shuddering so violently he could barely keep a grip on the clean and, as yet, unused knife. Shaking his head only slightly more erratically than his bodily spasms, the almost kind face before him began to contort into something almost as monstrous as the discarded mask. "Do it!" the man screamed, his voice a maniacal howl of madness. "Do it! And become... me." Again, the boy began to scuffle back, stumbling to his feet, still brandishing the knife with both hands outstretched. "Don't you dare walk away from me!" The man far more confidently got back to his feet, his posture hunched as he gazed down upon the lad. Connor continued to back away, while the stranger again matched every step. When his retreat was stopped short, as his back planted against something solid, however, the boy feared he had only one option left: to obey the stranger's demand, or join the others he had laid to rest. As the haunting figure stopped right in front of the kid, he once more dropped to his knees, now looking the boy straight in the eyes. Somewhere between his quaking body, the endless stream of tears blurring his vision, and the sensation of the flesh pushing slightly against the very tip of the blade he held, Connor finally understood why this man looked so familiar.
"No,"
the boy whimpered as he looked into the eyes he had seen reflected in the mirror countless times before. The face before him was more wrinkled, more sunken, and far more pale than his own, but he understood everything now. Though he couldn't truly know how old this version of himself had grown, the years had clearly not been kind. "We were always headed for this," the man said, his own eyes beginning to leak. "All you need is that first taste. That first taste of blood." Connor shook his head again, mentally pleading for any semblance of an escape. "Take mine. Kill me. Seal your fate. And mine." Releasing the blade from his grip, having only allowed his elder doppelganger to inflict no more than a surface wound on himself, the boy howled a more hopeless wail than he had yet. He pushed that emaciated chest, toppling the man to the concrete, taking one step forward and spinning to face what his back had planted against. When his eyes met a more perplexing sight, a door in frame with no walls on either side or above, as though it sprouted from the ground itself, he almost lost track of the fact he was not alone. His marbles returning before he could be jumped from behind, he spun to face his grotesque reflection, now lifting himself from the concrete, the haunting mask having somehow returned to his tormented face. As those blood-stained hands reached out for him, he practically darted for the door, which didn't really require much effort as he was standing right in front of the ruddy thing. He gripped the knob, screaming out his pleas to be granted entry to whatever lay beyond, throwing it open and launching himself over the threshold. Before he had a chance to turn and slam the door behind him, it closed of its own accord, almost inspiring him to jump out of his skin. He just stared at the door, the fluorescent lights flickering on above him. There was no pounding from the other side, no jiggles of the knob from his distorted mirror image attempting to enter. Only silence. Turning again to see what lay before him, he found himself in a wide and empty room with dark red carpet across the floor and a similar hue covering the walls and ceiling. There was another door right in the back of the room, parallel to the one from which he now edged away. As he paced forward, nearing his hopeful exit, with every hesitant step, he wished for nothing more than to find his way back to the loving embrace of his parents. His mind flashed with a collage of imagery, representing every tantrum and each exhausted expression of his folks over the span of a short life. He remembered so clearly every single harsh word he had spat in their direction, every time he had pounded on and kicked walls, whether in private or public, not caring about anyone or anything, only that he got his way. He saw the strain in his mother's eyes, and the stress on his father's, wanting nothing more than to apologize to them for all of it. Pushing through the door, bracing himself for whatever new horrors may lie ahead, he could barely believe his eyes when he looked upon those he so desperately wanted to make all the pain go away. Realizing he was looking back out into the park, with the people coming and going in either direction, he took one more hesitant glance to his rear, as hinges squealed behind him. With the door through which he had entered now wide open, his jaw once more fell limp at the sight of that familiar hall of mirrors. No bodies lay oozing on the floor, as they had when he had fled from it before, but it wasn't completely vacant. As he made eye contact with the lone, undistorted, warped, or bowed mirror, he once more looked upon the grotesque reflection of what he could be. Those dark, sunken sockets glaring back at him, that orange mask seamless to his face, that tattered coat caked with sticky gore. And without a second thought, Connor sped through the entrance back to the world beyond my little funhouse, wrapping his wee arms around both of his parents the second he closed the gap. "Whoa, kiddo," Mr. Jacob Rigby said with a weary chuckle. "Was it really that scary in there?"
Yeah,
Connor said, choosing not to get into his experience, only grateful that it was over. "But you were only in there, a few minutes?"
It felt like longer,
the boy said with a winded laugh. As the group began to walk away, the boy pleasantly requesting that they head back home, his parents caught off guard by his far less demanding demeanor, Connor gave one last glance back at me. I, being the gentleman I am, simply tipped my hat to the lad, offering him my most innocent smile. "Really? That's the part that makes you scream, pigtails? It's not that bad." Over the year that followed that night, though it took some time to truly change his ways, Connor managed to prove to his parents that he was not the monster they feared he would become. Yes, they never returned to this pleasant little funhouse, nor this park, but the elder Rigbys, for the first time in over a decade, they were finally content with the fact that Jacob hadn't the good sense to pull out, that they had chosen to become parents a decade or so prior to that trip. Of course, though the young boy himself felt more at peace than he ever had before, deep down in places he would never admit aloud, he enjoyed revisiting the memory of his visit to my funhouse of horror. That the imagery etched into the recesses of his mind, that of sticky fluids oozing from grotesque wounds carved into the flesh, would bring him a smile in the wee hours of the morning. and want me to lie ahead for Connor Rigby. Well, only time will tell that tale, just as I've spun this one to you little tykes now. Now, who's ready to head on in and find out what glorious sights await you in Damien Stitch's Funhouse of... Oi, where you going? Didn't he run off? Et tu, pigtails? Maybe I should have told them the one about the puppets.